Okay, welcome everyone to the Moving to Melbourne study in one of the world's most livable cities session this evening. My name is Jason and I'll be running the session tonight. With me I have Alec, who'll be helping me out with some Q&A at the end if there's time. So if you do have any questions on anything that's covered tonight, feel free to pop it in the chat and we'll reply to you there. And also perhaps expand on some topics in a bit more detail at the end of the presentation as well. To give you a bit of background on me, I'm not only a staff member at RMIT in the marketing and student recruitment team, but I'm also a graduate of RMIT's Bachelor of Business marketing program. So I'll be able to give some decent insight from a student's perspective as well. And whether you're into sports like me or love great food or don't mind a bit of a shop, Melbourne truly has it all. And in RMIT being right in the heart of the CBD and the surrounds, we really are the perfect choice for an unforgettable student experience. Now, I know moving away from home can be a very exciting time and it's easy to get caught up in that excitement. So in this presentation today, we're going to cover some key topics, not only on RMIT, but also things like accommodation options, how to get around Melbourne, cost of living, how to make friends, employment support, and a whole lot more. But before I start, however, I would like to say Wominjeka and welcome to you all. And I would like to acknowledge the people of the Wurrung and Bunurong language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation, on whose unceded lands I present to you today and conduct the business of the university. I would also like to respectfully acknowledge their ancestors and elders, past and present. Okay, so to get started, so welcome to Melbourne. So many of you might be familiar, but Melbourne is home to some of Australia's best known experiences. There's a diverse art scene, countless cuisines and eateries, and so much sport and entertainment that there's practically something happening every weekend. And if you think about all the international acts that come through to Australia, I dare say every single one of them comes through Melbourne, and that's for very good reason. It's that we're such an outgoing and social community that there's always a hot ticket in town, and some of you might have even visited before, whether it be for the Formula One or an AFL Grand Final even. And all of these events are why we truly are the sporting and cultural capital of Australia. I remember before finishing high school, I never really spent much time in the city. So although I didn't move out of home to study, I really felt like I was discovering a new city and a new way of life even when I started my degree. And just the fact that I was able to walk down to Queen Vic Market, for example, and grab one of those hot churros on my lunch break, or head down to Melbourne Central and go for a shop between lectures. These are the little things that added so much value to my student experience as an RMIT student. Now, moving on to our campuses. So as you can see on your screens there, these are all of our campuses in Melbourne. Now, the most important takeaway from this is that depending on which course you plan to study, this will determine where you're predominantly located at throughout your studies. So with also our flight training programs located at Bendigo and Point Cook. But for the three main Melbourne campuses, we'll start with the City campus, which is the largest of the three and is home to just under 50,000 students. It houses the majority of our courses, including things like business, IT, architecture, engineering, media, and science, just to name a few. And is truly the heart, in the heart of Melbourne, extending from Bourke Street right all the way up to Lygon Street in Carlton. Now, it's not a traditional university campus as you might find, but rather it's sort of interlaced throughout the CBD. And going from class to class is when you'll find all the amazing food and coffee that we as Melburnians are always big advocates for. So be prepared to make a few stops along the way to your next lecture. Moving on to our Brunswick campus now, which is the home to our fashion, textiles and industrial design type programs. It's a much smaller campus and has a bit more of a relaxed feel than the City campus, with about 2,500 students, and is only about 5 kilometres out from the CBD. The fashion hub that's located at our Brunswick campus has state-of-the-art facilities with all the sort of specialist equipment that you need to complete the coursework of your program, whether it's sewing machines, things like that, and there's even a runway on campus as well. We then have our Bundoora campus, which is about 18 kilometres from Melbourne city centre, and is a bit more of that traditional campus that I touched on earlier, surrounded by sort of parkland and open spaces. The Bundoora campus houses RMIT's health and medical science programs, including things like sport and exercise science, nursing, and some engineering and teaching programs as well. It's also home to a wide range of sporting facilities that are used by the student community and professional sporting teams as well. And then lastly, we have our flight training programs located at Bendigo and Point Cook. So there's a bit of flexibility there in terms of location, with Bendigo being in Victoria's north and Point Cook just in Melbourne's west, only 30 minutes from the CBD, and is one of the oldest operating air bases in Australia. However, if flying airplanes isn't your strong suit, then don't worry, because as you can see up on the board, we have plenty of programs on offer and different interest areas on offer at RMIT. Now, this is more of a high level sort of overall look at what we can offer, so don't panic if you can't see the course that you want to study, as it most likely falls under one of these sort of broader categories. For example, a degree in journalism would fall under communications, or under our engineering sort of umbrella there, we have over 10 different types of engineering, including civil and infrastructure, things like advanced manufacturing and mechatronics, and environmental engineering as well, just to name a few. I can only recommend that you also take a look at the more program specific sessions as well that will be happening on Open Day on the 29th, as this is where you'll be able to hear from the teachers and students who sort of teach and learn these courses every day. But moving on to online enabled study, and something that's important to note is that at all levels of study at RMIT, from vocational study, so diplomas, certificates, all the way up to postgraduate degrees, we really offer online delivery to all of our courses, both locally and all around the world. Traditionally, RMIT's online delivery contains a mix of lectures, tutorials, workshops, seminars and practical components as well, depending on the program that a student is enrolled in. Now, given the current circumstances and things like lockdowns and things like that, we've ensured that the safety and well-being of our students and staff is at the highest priority, and we've become very agile in being able to suspend face-to-face learning and teaching in order to remain in line with the government requirements as needed. And there's plenty of help to support students as they continue to stay from home. In terms of the facilities, for example, there's plenty of programs and tools that are offered to students to be able to use to navigate through their classes. Things like Collaborate Ultra, which allows for breakout rooms and more interactive sessions. Things like Microsoft Teams for discussion and video conferences. So what the presentation today is being delivered on Microsoft Teams, for example, and as a staff member, we've used that, and students have access to it as well. And then access also to a range of software by My Desktop, where some might be applicable to your coursework and some might just be personal that you can use as well. And students all have access to that from their home computers when studying at home, obviously. And during semesters, we conduct things like poll surveys to receive sort of immediate feedback that we can apply it as soon as possible. So we're continuously looking to improve on the student experience, particularly as uncertain times arise during snap lockdowns and things like that. Moving on to getting around Melbourne. So this is probably more information for those who are unfamiliar and maybe perhaps haven't been to Melbourne before. Some of you might have been able to spend a weekend or made a day trip here, but essentially the first step to getting around Melbourne is with a MyKey card, and this would cover things like buses, trams and trains, and each of our campuses are located within close proximity to stations and stops, making it really easy to get around, regardless of where you're living or which campus you're potentially studying at. It costs about $6 to get a MyKey card, and as a full-time student you'd also be eligible for a concession MyKey as well, meaning that every trip is about 50% off the full price through the duration of your studies. and you can apply for this concession card after you enroll. But essentially, this means that a daily trip around Melbourne will only set you back about $4.50 at a maximum, which is obviously amazing value, and it's something that I definitely miss about being a student. We also have the free tram zone in the CBD, which makes it really easy to sort of duck out to those restaurant and bars I sort of made mention to earlier at no extra cost to you. And in terms of parking, at our Brunswick and Bundoora campus, there is meter parking available if you prefer to drive, where in the city it tends to be a little bit more expensive and sometimes, let's say, more competitive to find a parking spot as well. But you can also look into securing a spot at different car parks for months at a time to save money where you can as well. We also have amazing facilities for cyclists. So if you need a secure place to leave your bike while you're at your classes, there are showers, lockers, hair dryers, and everything you need to make sure that you can sort of freshen up before class as well. Moving on to cost of living. Now, as I mentioned earlier, moving out of home can be perhaps one of the most exciting times of your life, but it's also important to have a think about the costs that might be involved as well. Now, a lot of these costs can be fixed, whereas others can vary depending on perhaps how lavish a lifestyle you plan on living while you're at uni. So starting with rent, for example, it can vary quite dramatically from $120 to $300 per week. Now, as you can imagine, living right in the middle of in the city in an apartment would cost a bit more than perhaps a share house on the outskirts of the CBD, for example. So that's one thing to consider. Things like food can vary. You'll find that there'll be at least perhaps one day a week where we'll have that internal struggle on whether or not to get Uber Eats or to have that maybe leftover pasta from the night before, and things like entertainment and movie tickets. Although things are unfortunately closed at the moment, these are things that can creep up into your expenses as well. So I would encourage you all to do some research, but there's obviously some really rough figures on the board on the slide there for you as well. And it's a good idea to do some research so you can get an accurate idea of what your budget might be and what you can sustain as a student. One tip that I would advise you of is that perhaps 9 times out of 10, a lot of these places, particularly in the city, would have student discounts. So everywhere you go, I would definitely recommend asking if there's a sort of student or concession discount, whether that means you get an extra pancake at the pancake parlor or save up a couple of dollars here and there. It all adds up. So I would definitely recommend you do that as well. There are also a number of RMIT resources available to you to help keep track of your finances while you're a student, so you can remain on budget. And there's also scholarships as well, which can supplement your living costs and assist with cost of living expenses, which I'll go into in a bit more detail a bit later on. Now, moving to a new location means that you might need to leave your current job and look for work perhaps in a new city, and we have plenty of employment support available to help students through that. And I know this is definitely something that probably sounds daunting, but we can provide you as much peace of mind as possible, and I'll tell you a little bit about the support services that RMIT have in place to help you find work during your studies. Firstly, we have the RMIT Job Shop, and they're there to help you with anything you might need from resume writing workshops or cover letter reviews, things like that. All things that can give you the confidence to take those experiences out and give you the confidence when you're actually applying for real life jobs. I, for example, when I was a student, sat through mock interview processes and things like that to really practice those sorts of things. And it can go a long way and be really invaluable in building your confidence and getting you prepared for the workforce, not only during your program, but obviously after graduating as well. There's also a dedicated RMIT Career Hub platform for students, which advertises jobs both on and off campus with our partners and local businesses. And you can even get professional headshots taken for your LinkedIn profile, for example. Now, these jobs would range from part-time work to work you might consider post-graduation, like internships and things like that, that can even be credited towards your degree, both paid and unpaid and things like that. There's plenty of variety on there, and it's a service and a platform that I definitely recommend students look into once they become RMIT students. On the Careers Hub also, there's a lot of cool workshops that students can sign up for, covering a range of topics, from industry professionals giving an insight to their day-to-day and the skills that they've developed over time, but also employability based ones like how to optimize your LinkedIn profile, for example. These are obviously optional, but again, I highly recommend all students take advantage of these sorts of services and these tips and tricks while they're available to them, because when it comes towards sort of the back end of your degree and you're starting to look at graduate opportunities, this information that you already have, it can really set yourself apart from everyone else from an employability standpoint, and it's something that I definitely recommend students take into account. Lastly, there are also a number of careers fair events that give you a platform to directly speak with employers to find out what type of applicants they're looking for in their graduate program. So, and that really sort of gives you the best chance of success when looking for work opportunities after finishing your program as well. I remember when I was approaching my sort of internship year and I was starting to get invited to things like interviews and assessment centres, which was something I had never heard of before. There are a lot of things that I didn't quite understand, and the employment support at RMIT was massively important to me to sort of help me settle down, make sense of everything that I was reading, and allow me to prepare so I could give the sort of the best account of myself in the real life sort of job interview situation. And it's something that, yeah, I can not recommend highly enough. But moving on to student accommodation. Yep, there are a few different options of arrangements to take into consideration when relocating. And before I get into those, I just want to stress that we offer housing, legal and financial services and support to all students. So you can definitely inquire further about anything you might learn today. Firstly, we have purpose-built accommodation, such as the Dwell Village or the Bundoora Uni Lodge, for example. And these are all student-specific accommodation options that are often located on or very close to campus. And I'll go into a bit more detail on this shortly. Then we have renting and sharing options. So this is a more sort of budget-friendly option. So if you have a few friends potentially, perhaps looking to relocate as well, it's a really good way to sort of move with a group that's sort of familiar with you. And there's plenty of websites and Facebook groups and things like that, for example, that advertise private vacancies and things like that. And then there's also hostels, which could probably be the most budget-friendly option. And then homestays as well, where, for example, a family or a couple might have a specific room to rent or something like that. So there's plenty of options. And again, I know this sort of information can definitely be overwhelming, and I'm sure a lot of you perhaps have already started that sort of research. So we have plenty of support available that we would love to provide to you if you want to get in touch with us about that. So if you're unsure what might suit you best, or you just want to reaffirm what you might already be thinking, you can definitely get in touch with our student welfare advisors about that. But moving on to purpose-built accommodation. So as I touched on earlier, RMIT has, we have a selected number of purpose-built student accommodation properties, which sort of meet our high quality and safety standards. So on our website and in the next slide, you'll be able to see a list of our preferred accommodation providers that can provide sort of a more supportive and engaging student experience, which are also highly convenient in terms of their location being close to our campuses and public transport and things like that. These properties have all the facilities imaginable, and I've been lucky enough to go on a tour on a few of them prior to COVID, of course, and it was nearly made me wish that during my studies to relocate from my place, which is barely 30 minutes outside the CBD, to move to be right on campus, because it really is a very good living arrangement and lifestyle that you can create there. At these providers, you obviously have the benefit of living with RMIT and other university students. You can pay just the one inclusive bill that covers all utilities and services, and there's plenty of social activity happening in the indoor and outdoor community areas as well. And these are all just sort of the little things that can help ease the transition from living at home to then obviously living away. And with 24/7 service and security, there's always staff there to support you with anything you might need to help make the transition as seamless as possible. But as I mentioned, so this would be the list of our approved accommodation providers. And as you can see, there are a number of options. So I'm confident there will be at least one that maybe speaks out to you and could be a perfect fit. And we also have options at our Bundoora campus, which I'll have on the next slide. But essentially, these providers don't make it on this screen unless they meet our safety and standard policies. So you can be confident that at these places, you'll have everything you need and everything will be up to the necessary standard to allow you to enjoy your experiences in living in Melbourne. But moving on to our Bundoora campus now, and as I touched on, we do have the Uni Lodge, which is about 100 meters from where your classes will be. So for those who perhaps hit the snooze button one too many times, this can be a great option for you if you're studying at the Bundoora campus. It has all of the state-of-the-art facilities that I've sort of touched on earlier, where you'll also even have 2, 3, or even 4 bedroom sort of shared apartments available. So there's definitely some flexibility there based on your living preferences. And as you can see in the screen there's a bit of a common area as well, both a kitchenette and a sort of lounge area where you share with your 2 or 3 roommates. And it's just a really good balance of both privacy when you need it, but also social interaction as well, which is probably more important now more than ever. So a lot of these choices come down to things like budget and personal preference, but I'll mention one more time, you can speak to our student welfare advisor or ask a question in the chat if you're wanting more information in any of this on your options, because I can understand that this can definitely be a lot of information to take in. So it's important to sort of process it at your own pace, particularly because it's quite a busy time for you all as well. Moving on now to safer community and support. So for everything we do on campus, we do have 24/7 on-campus security and patrol at all times. So for example, during exam periods, sometimes an all-nighter might be required, although I don't perhaps recommend it. I, for example, was one that found studying on campus was most productive rather than studying at home, and so it would always be reassuring to me that even if I was heading home at something like a crazy hour like 3 a.m. or something like that, that there was security around keeping an eye on things and ensuring everyone's safety. On top of this, we also have the Safe Zone app, which is a free app to alert security for first aid or with an emergency button as a precaution as well. We also have support for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. So our Negara Willem Centre are there to help engage with you through your academic journey. And they do have orientation week and a cultural space on each of our campuses where you can meet other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students as well, and take part in a range of cultural and sort of community-based activities. There are other little sort of services like for example, the Bundoora courtesy bus is just a little one. Now, I was a student at the city campus, but all of my friends that I'd made who were based in Bundoora always raved on about the courtesy bus, and that was just something as simple as a bus on a loop to come through and take you off to different points in the campus, and also to the Uni Hill shopping centre, which is across the road from the Bundoora campus as well. And that something like that, again, it's not an ridiculous service or anything like that, but it's just the little things that really assist through and help with the student experience, and something that, as I said, my friends raved on about. But a big one, for example, would be, as I said, the accommodation, legal and financial support, as I touched on earlier. And a big one would be things like the equitable learning services. So in case you're impacted by any sort of disability or mental health or long-term illness, our team can sit down with you and put together a support plan for assistance with anything you might need, whether it's for basic reading or writing or for specific assignments and exams, things like that, because we understand that those periods can be quite stressful stressful for students, it's something that they're there to assist you through that. Similarly, our mental and wellbeing counselling staff are there and available on each campus in case you need sort of a safe space for some of that sort of confidential support as well. This is definitely available as well. We understand that if you're relocating to Melbourne, whether you're regional or interstate or even international students, you perhaps face different challenges that just local and domestic students might face. So we understand that's all part of the student experience, and we definitely have the support services in place there to assist you through things like that. Moving on to scholarships now. So we're nearly wrapping up, and with scholarships, these can help and assist with all kinds of study costs, whether it be textbooks or fees, accommodation or living costs and more. There are a number of scholarships that are available to students upcoming and ongoing. There are a number of categories as well, as you can see up on the screen there, from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander support to academic achievement, accommodation, equity, external. So for example, a number of our industry partners come through and offer varying scholarships for specific study areas or disciplines as well. And then we also have things like international student scholarship, things that are program specific, travel and scholarships for women as well. So for example, women in STEM is a big example there. So one important thing to note is that with each scholarship on our website, each scholarship may have its own sort of specific criteria and can vary in application process. So it's always best to double check this information on our website and get started where you can to avoid missing out on any potential deadlines. Particularly with the accommodation scholarships, there are varying amounts available depending on the provider as well. So definitely I would recommend doing a little bit of research to ensure that you shore up on this knowledge and you know sort of what going into it, because it's quite obviously a busy period for you. Also, you want to make sure you know all of the information where you can. But things to consider. So we've touched on a number of topics tonight, and there are a few sort of questions that I'm sure beyond this slide that you'll have lingering. But to address some of those things, and I probably have already touched on some of them. Firstly, which RMIT campus or site will I be studying at, for example? So that's an easy one. As I mentioned earlier, depending on the course that you study at, that will determine where the most part of your program, or in most cases all of it, would be located. It's not that the other campuses are not available to you. So for example, I was a student at the city campus, but a lot of the sporting facilities, for example, was located at our Bundoora campus. So I would spend a lot of time in Bundoora over there. So it's important to take those sorts of things into consideration as well. But yeah, predominantly where you'll be studying at is where you'll be located. So you obviously want to be looking into accommodation options around there. How much can I afford for rent and the other costs? That's obviously a big one as well, because yes, you can work part-time to supplement your income and things like that, but also there are ways to sort of make living away from home less expensive, whether it tends to be a share house on the sort of outside of not outside of Melbourne, but outside the CBD at least. You know that the public transport network is strong enough to be able to get you there quite quickly anyway. So for example, where I live in the western suburbs of Melbourne, it takes me about perhaps 25 minutes to drive in with a bit of morning traffic, but the train would get me there probably in 20 minutes. So it's quite less to get the train because it avoids obviously all the traffic. So these are little things that you can consider. And there's plenty of tips and tricks that our student welfare advisors can provide you to sort of give you that advice on how to save money as you're making these sorts of decisions. The other thing is what type of accommodation suits me. So in terms of the different types, obviously we ran through a few today, but sometimes students find that what might be suitable for their friends perhaps is not suitable for them, and that's perfectly okay. And that's why it's always best to do some research so you can take the sort of living style and cost and all those things into account and in its entirety, really. Other things like, are there shops, cafes, or medical assistance? The purpose-built accommodations, for example, most commonly will have all of these things nearby or on site as well. But it just depends on exactly where it is that you're wanting to live. If you're living in a busy sort of inner suburb, it's likely that a lot of those facilities would be available, if not a short tram ride or bus ride away, whatever it might be. And obviously, if you have a car, you're planning to have a car and drive. If you're out in the suburbs a little bit, things are quite accessible that way as well. And then if we go down the list there, I'm sure these are all things that you've considered as well. And in terms of when do my classes start and things like that, generally students probably show up to their accommodation a few weeks before classes start, just to make sure they're all settled in and things like that. And these are all things that I'm sure you'll discover as you're going through the process and uncovering more information. But of course, you can always reach out to us if you have any questions. And if you go on the next slide, I'll have a link there for you where you can have a look to our Moving to Melbourne page, which basically summarises all the sort of tips and tricks that you can sort of take into account before making a decision in terms of accommodation and things like that. But that brings me to the end of the session today. Thank you very much all for attending, and I hope I was able to answer your questions. If there's any questions in the chat, I hope they're being answered. But if not, I'll hand it off to Alec for some questions perhaps that have come through.
Awesome. Thank you, Jason. Yeah, there have been a few questions that have come through into the chat. First question being, where can I find information about RMIT preferred accommodation suppliers?
Yeah, perfect. So, yeah, that a lot of that information is on our website. So if you go to it's rmit.edu.au, and I'm sure one of my colleagues can pop the link in the chat. But on the RMIT website, they'll have plenty of information there about not only the accommodation suppliers, but also links and contact emails and phone numbers and things like that, where you can ask any sort of specific questions. And they'll have profiles on the accommodation suppliers as well, where you can read up a bit of the information. Now, unfortunately, I suspect there probably wouldn't be any tours available at the moment. But I'm sure all your questions can be answered in those sorts of instances for any lingering questions that you might have.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that, Jason. I've got another question now. When should I apply for accommodation?
Yep, perfect. Great question. In terms of when you should apply, that would be on the same link, that sort of information. Each provider would have their own specific dates and things like that as to when you should apply. Now, I generally recommend that that's something that you look into quite early, just because it can take some time to sort of make those arrangements and fill in the necessary forms and application and things like that. It also would depend on what sort of accommodation you're looking for, because sometimes if you're looking to do a private rental, for example, that process can be a lot more straightforward sometimes, rather than going through a purpose built and things like that. So it depends on the type of accommodation, but yeah, that our advisors are there to help, and you can even book an appointment with them as well if you want to see a student welfare officer who can assist you through sort of the relevant timelines and things like that.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. I've got another question that's just popped through. My child is relocating to study at RMIT. Do you have any advice on how we can prepare?
Yeah, definitely. Now, we definitely have a lot of support available, and first of all, what I always recommend is lean on friends and family and your obviously your networks who might have made this move before, or have a child or someone who has made this sort of move before, because that, and I was the same when I finished university. I relied heavily on my brother, who was also an RMIT student a few years before me, for those sorts of little bits of information that you might not be able to discover necessarily online. So really taking into account what other people have done and sort of going by that. But also we have a Moving to Melbourne page. So if you probably Google search RMIT Moving to Melbourne, you can see a lot of resources there, and it covers sort of a lot of the things we've talked about. So things like public transport, the lifestyle and culture, accommodation options, events, because a lot of this information, for example, you might also discover at things like orientation events and things like that. So there's plenty of information online, both outside the RMIT website and obviously on the RMIT website, but I would also recommend, and there's an accommodation guide that can be downloaded as well, but I would also recommend leaning on your networks and friends and family to cover some of those sort of questions that might not be necessarily available online. Yeah,
thanks for that. And now we've just got one more question that's popped through. Where can I find information about part-time work?
Yeah, perfect. There is definitely an employment section on that Moving to Melbourne page that I made mention to. Again, while I would imagine that not all students would probably want to jump right into part-time work as soon as they relocate. So once you're here and once you've started, there's plenty of careers and employability support that is available to students that they can take advantage of. And as I sort of touched on, things like the Careers Hub, for example, once you're an RMIT student, you have access to that. There are often jobs there that are advertised exclusively to RMIT students as well. So there's plenty of support and things like that in place available. But in terms of sort of preparatory sort of work before you actually arrive, or during this sort of time before you actually finish your Year 12 studies, potentially there's definitely information there on the RMIT website. You can look at things like youth allowance as well, so you can get apply for sort of government payments as to supplement your income if you work under a certain amount of hours on a part-time basis as well. So there's plenty of both RMIT and government support available for students, especially for those who are making the big move to a new city, to sort of help that transition, definitely.
Great. Thank you for all that detailed and insightful information, Jason. I'll pass it back off to you now.
Perfect. So yeah, thanks very much. Thanks everyone very much for joining me today. Again, I hope your questions were answered, and you can always go to. There's going to be more sessions like this, and more probably program specific sessions during Open Day as well on the 29th of August, if you wish to chase up any more of that program specific information. But thank you everyone for joining, and I wish you a good night. Thank you.